What a privilege to be with you guys. I've got 1,800 seconds to try to get along a message here, so we'll just jump in. There are only two views among us. The one is that everything's the result of a cosmic accident, or we're the result of a deliberate design, and that implies a designer. That's the first Y in the road that would divide us. Now, that basic thing brings us each to three questions, personal questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? And where am I going when I die? Those issues face every one of us. Now, most of you that know me from our broadcasts or whatever know that our entire ministry, the last 5 decades, have been based on two discoveries. And my telling you is not enough. You have to discover this for yourself. The first is that we have 66 books, hopefully sitting in your lap, that were written by over 40 guys who didn't even know each other over a period of almost 2,000 years. The discovery is, in two parts, we have in our possession an integrated message system. Even though it was written in 66 books by over 40 guys over almost 2,000 years, we now discover that every detail, every number, every place name is there by deliberate design. And that's something you have to discover for yourself. But when you do, it'll change your entire perspective, because you'll stumble to a second discovery deriving from that one, that the origin of that message system had to come from outside our time domain, because it writes history before it happens with a precision that's staggering. And those discoveries are something you need to discover for yourself. And I don't mean just thematically. Every number, every letter in both the Old and New Testament is there in the original, is there by deliberate design. Now, we made reference here to Psalm 19. C.S. Lewis says the greatest psalm in the Psalms and one of the greatest lyrics in the world. Let's take a close look at the first few verses of Psalm 19. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day uttereth speech, and night unto night showeth knowledge. There is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. Their line has gone out throughout all the earth, and their words to the end of the world. That may be familiar to you, but let's examine it. You'll discover every line talks about the information sciences. Declare, showeth, other speech, showeth knowledge, speech, language, voice. See, every line speaks of the information sciences. And so the point of this is there is no speech or language where their voice is not heard. That's holding us all accountable. And Paul makes that point in Romans chapter 1. The invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, but being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. And so that holds us accountable too. The following terms, I want to show you a series of opposites. We have disorder and order, noise and signal. Engineers like to improve the signal to noise ratio. Cacophony and music, chaos and cosmos, randomness or design. Those are opposites. We need to understand that. Those on the left are all expressions of a term that mathematically we call entropy. Think of entropy as randomness, and you'd be shocked at how many brilliant mathematicians, including Stephen Hawking, don't follow this correctly. Entropy is equivalent to randomness. The opposite of that is information. Each one on the left is the opposite of the ones on the right. And you need to understand those are opposites. In fact, as time goes on, things will drift to the left. You clean up your garage or your locker in school. After a few weeks, it's back the way it was. Things tend towards randomness, towards entropy. And I want to develop that a little as we go. Randomness and entropy, most of us have been trained in deterministic mathematics. But there's a whole other field of mathematics, stochastic, where there's random variables involved. It's a different process. In fact, random numbers are almost impossible to find. What you technically find when you need them are what called pseudo-random numbers that are almost random. Getting a true random number is a real challenge. In fact, the granddaddy of think tanks, the Rand Corporation, back in 1955, had a milestone book, which they published, called 1 Million Random Digits and 100,000. That book, if I had it sitting here, I don't carry it because it's big and heavy, but the point is, that book, if you look at it, you think it's a put-on, a joke. You open it up, and it's full of random numbers. And to the layman, you sort of laugh. That's pretty silly. No. It was a breakthrough in science because the Rand Corporation had access to the most powerful computers available at that time. And the idea, that's not as trivial as it sounds. What is the defining characteristic of that book? The total absence of design. They used supercomputers to explore that thoroughly so there was no symmetry, no predictability, no patterns of any kind, no predictability. As best as we could make it at that time, that was the best available. That was a source of random numbers. That may sound silly if you haven't been in a laboratory where you need random numbers for some purpose. They're hard to find. So with that background, I want to move into the topic that they've asked me to speak on, Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Now, if you master and understand and command that, it'll solve all your other problems. That's the granddaddy of them all. In the Hebrew, of course, it goes from right to left. All languages flow towards Jerusalem. You know that. East of Jerusalem, they go right to left. West of Jerusalem, they go left to right. And whether it's Cyrillic or English or Latin on the one hand, or Aramaic, Hebrew, or whatever on the Sanskrit on the right. But anyway, Bereshit, bara, the word bara is to create out of nothing. There are other words that can be used, asa or vasa, that's to make or fashion. When it used bara, that's from out of nothing. And then we encounter Bereshit bara Elohim. Now, you probably know enough Hebrew exposure to know that a masculine word with an I-am ending is a plural. Elohim is a plural noun. But there's something very strange because every time you see that in the Bible, it's misused. You know enough about language to know the noun is supposed to be declined with the verb. They're supposed to match. Elohim is a plural noun, but it's always used as a singular by the verb. Elohim, every place you see it, is a technical error in a sense. Elohim is a plural noun. What you also need to know about Hebrew is that a plural is not two, it's three. They have a single, a dual, and a plural. But let's move on and take a look at Genesis 1, because that's really the subject here. God said, let there be light, and there was light, and God saw the light, and that it was good. God divided the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were day one. And now, the word evening, that's translated evening, comes from the word erev. That came to mean eve, but that wasn't the original concept behind it. And the other word is boker, which is, now they use it for morning. Why do they do that? Because neither of these, by the way, will show up on day 7. Did it not have an evening and morning? Of course it did. But what the words are focusing is on a prior, more pervasive meaning. Let's take a look at an entropy profile of the universe. I'm putting entropy at the bottom of the chart and order at the top. In other words, entropy is the maximum at the bottom, and order is maximum at the top. Are you with me so far? Okay. Day 1, we have erev and boker, which is a reduction of entropy or an increase in order. Okay. Erev means disorder or obscurity, and at night things are dark and obscure. And that word also becomes meaning for night, but it's a pun, but it's the prior meaning is erev. Boker is discernible order. We're going from disorder to order, going from erev to boker. And that comes to mean morning and evening, but that is a pun, if you will, of a deeper meaning, if I may. Now, on that first day, God makes his first direct quote in the Bible, "Let light be." And let's take a look at, as we study the very nature of light. Boy, we could spend a whole hour talking about that. But most of you realize that every particle has an antiparticle, and when an antiparticle hits a positive particle, they annihilate each other and give off a photon, give off light. And Richard Feynman will tell you a reversal of light, that particle is that same particle in a time reversal. But another way of saying that is if I reverse the entropy, that shows how light can create a symmetrical set of particles out of nothing. And that's the mechanism we find in day 1. But let's move to day 2. From Erev to Boker, there's another step of creation, and that's creating the atoms and the molecules. Let's talk about an atom, because this is a grasp you really need to get. We've all in school made little diagrams, and I'll use a hydrogen, one of the simple ones. We have a nucleus and an electron going around it. This is not the scale, but I'm going to try to communicate the scale to you if I can. We know that the atom is about 10 to the minus 8 centimeters in size. The nucleus is about 10 to the minus 13. The numbers aren't important, but the ratio is. What we're saying here is that it takes 100,000 that distance to make the orbit of the electron. 100,000. The ratio between the two is 10 to the 5th, 100,000. Well, if that's the linear distance, the area would be that squared, right? So that would be 10 to the 10th. The volume would be that number cubed. You with me so far? How many follow that? Okay, good, great. You need talking to men. Women usually aren't with me here. Okay. So that's the 10 to the 15th number is a staggering number. And I remember I was on a board with Dr. Teller, and they were using a 10 to the 15th number, and I said, wow, that's more than there are seconds in 30 million years. And they looked at me shocked. They use those numbers, but they didn't have a personal grasp of what they mean. See, 10 to the 15th is the same ratio as 1 second has to 30 million years. See, when I say it that way, you get a feeling for what 10 to the 15th is. If I say this podium is solid, and you'd say, no, Chuck, there's nothing here, you're more right than I am by a ratio of 1 second to 30 million years. This is an electrical simulation. It feels solid because the molecules of my hand are colliding with the molecules of the... So it feels solid. That's an electrical illusion. It's a virtual thing. We're going to get into that, believe it or not. So Pastor Z. We're learning the properties. Space is not empty. It has permittivity. It has permeability. As any radio ham will tell you, it has intrinsic impedance. When you tune an antenna for transmission, you're trying to match the impedance to the impedance of space. Velocity of light, of course, has been slowing down. That's a whole other story. But the zero-point energy, most physicists will tell you that's just a mathematical concept. No, there's a surprise coming. They've now discovered that the zero-point energy is measurable, it's staggering, and it's revising our whole perception of subatomic particles. So that it happens as you get into that and really understand the fabric space, the arguments fall into our lap as creationists, by the way. And I won't go into all the details there. I'll just highlight that you be aware of this as you hear talked about. If the temperature of an empty container is lowered to absolute zero, there remains a residual amount of thermal energy that cannot by any means be removed. It's called the zero-point energy. A vacuum is now known to be a vast reservoir of seething energy of which that particles being formed and annihilated constantly. Why does the electron in an atom not radiate itself out and collapse? Why doesn't that happen? Because it's made up by the zero-point energy replaces it. And that's why they continue. That's exactly what Paul tells you in 1 Colossians 1, by the way. But we'll move on here. Let's go to day, we're just getting warmed up. We're going to day 3 already. And there we have the land and the oceans and so forth. Just take one thing off the earth, take a leaf off a tree, and you discover it's more complicated than most of us can possibly understand. In fact, not only that leaf itself, but its place in the cycle. The plants give off the oxygen and the sugar, and the animals need that, and they give off the CO2, which the plants need. And this whole model is in balance. That not only means it was created, it means it's being maintained. They always say 1% change in the ozone is going to bring cosmic disaster. You've heard that from your greenies, right? Well, if that's true, who balanced it so delicately in the first place? See, that argument that it's rare is an argument for creation, not the accident of design. But we'll move on. Let's go to day 4. Erev and Boker, we come to what we call our solar system. Bear with me on this model, because I think this is one of the things you'll want to take away in your notes. Robert Burnham publishes a celestial almanac, and in that he has a chapter that's too provocative to pass. He takes advantage of a coincidence. The number of inches in a statute mile is 63,360. Okay. It turns out, the basic unit in astronomy is the distance from the Earth to the sun. That's called an astronomical unit. It happens, the number of inches of a statute mile is roughly about 63,300. The number of astronomical units in a light year is roughly the same number to a 0.1% difference. So that's a convenient way to make a model. If we're going to make a model here of the universe, we can use that ratio and carry it out. In Burnham's model, 1 inch represents the distance of the sun to the Earth. 1 mile represents a light year. You with me so far? Okay. Well, the sun is about a 9,000th of an inch. Let's call it a 100th of an inch. Okay. So it's about the size of a period on a sentence on your paper. On your piece of paper, you have a period there. That's about, I'm going to suggest that's probably about a 100th of an inch. You with me? That's the size of our sun in this model. All planets will turn out to be lying within a 1 meter circle. The Earth will be 1 inch away from the sun by definition. Mercury and Venus, 4/10 or 7/10 radius. Mars about 1.6 inches. Jupiter about 5 inches. Saturn about 9.5. Uranus about 19.2. Neptune 30.0. Pluto 39.5 inches. In other words, if we're building this model, we have a period, the center at the sun, and the entire model would be within a radius of 1 meter. Are we together so far? So far we're doing it. We can sort of visualize that. That's important. Well, the nearest star is Alpha Centauri, 4.5 light years away. Okay, so we need a speck. It's about the same size as our sun, so it's a speck about the size of a period that we've got to not only place 4.5 miles away in our model. Okay, that's 2 specks of dust, 4.5 miles apart. How much influence would gravity have? Two specks of dust, 4.5 miles away, when you're supposed to square the distance between them. In other words, it's worse than that. By the way, the Milky Way would be 100,000 miles in radius. If you look at your equation of gravitation, it has a denominator of the distance squared. In other words, whatever the distance is, you've got to square that in the denominator, which means the further away they are, it disappears into being meaningless. You with me so far? See, the plasma physicists have been trying to tell that to us for several decades. The astronomers aren't listening. They haven't done the math. If you take a look at your fundamental forces from your textbooks, you'll discover that gravity is 10 to the minus 38, electromagnetic 10 to the minus 2. In other words, electromagnetics outperform gravity by 10 with 36 zeros after it. Not 36,000 times, 36 umptiums, whatever you're going to call. And by the way, electric pushes and pulls. Gravity doesn't. So the real point is, the minute you go beyond our solar system and look at the sky, the galaxies, gravity is a non-player. And what's astonishing, there are bright mathematicians spinning all kinds of theories that make no sense because they haven't done the math. 99.9% of the mass of the universe is not solid. It's not solid, liquid, or gas. It's plasma. It is ionized gas. And the plasma pioneers have been trying to tell us that they can create the same shapes in the laboratory using Maxwell equations, not gravity. And so we have all this in our briefing package if you want to chase these things down. But the real point is, let's go one step further. We then have the birds, and we have this whole business of the death of Darwinism. The thing that put the nails in Darwin's coffin was, of course, microbiology. Advances in microbiology, the DNA and so forth, have dealt the death blow to Darwinism. The DNA happens to be, we discover, a 3 out of 4 error-correcting code. An alphabet of 3, to use 3 out of 4, alphabet of 22, 3 out of 4. That is, there's probably not an engineer in the audience that can build and can design an error-correcting code. Error detecting, step 1. No, the next step is an error-correcting code. It turns out if you use 11 bits rather than 8 for a byte, you can make it error-correcting to a certain level. We've now discovered, recently there's articles, they've discovered that the code in the DNA has a code within the code, because there's common codes that do the same thing, but not quite the same thing. And they take a little longer because it changes the three-dimensional shape and There's more coding that they're discovering. There's a whole other level of coding to it. Darwinism cannot explain the origin of life because it cannot explain the origin of information. That's the corker. Irreducible complexity that Michael B. introduces definitely just renders chance or randomness as it refutes that as a possible designer. And you can get into that on your own. But let's take 6. You've always heard the 6 is the number of man. How many have heard that? Biblically. Well, it's a little more than that. We go on the 6th day, and I'm going to use Da Vinci's Vitruvian of man as a symbol of man and his reach, if you will. 6 is the number of man we hear. It turns out, I read this and I didn't believe it. I thought it was some Christian contrivance. I checked it out. It turns out to be true. A cellular level, an intact human immune system will virtually always recognize and reject a non-human transplant as foreign. How? The underlying characteristic, what's the underlying characteristic of humanity? On virtually every nucleated cell in a person are small markers, lipoproteins to be precise, called antigens. Their official designation is the histocompatibility antigen or human leukocyte antigen. HLA is the common thing. And it turns out certain antigens are the same in every human and are only found in humans, although given individuals may have different arrangements and collections of these molecules. That's what makes it's important in blood transfusions and other things. The irony is that every person, on virtually every cell in that person, this marker mankind's product, and it's a product of one certain chromosome. Its chromosome, guess which number? 6. I used to think that was a contrivance. No, it turns out that's the locus of the genes that encode humans on the surface of the cells and so forth. And so it has many other functions, but it resides on number 6. I thought that was interesting. But the interesting, provocative thing, when you get to day 7, we know that the creation stopped, right? How many knew that God rested on the 7th day? Okay, not on Sunday. That's sad. That's Shabbat, by the way. But let's move on here. Okay. What's interesting is there's no Erev and Boker on that day. That's a tip-off that those words had more original. They're used as puns for evening and morning daily, and that's why the Hebrew calendar starts in the evening, ends in the morning because of that patterning. But that's not what the words originally meant. In fact, when we go through Genesis and our commentary, we have a full lecture series on each day. On day 1, we get into the paradoxical nature of light itself, the gap between the first 2 verses, and that sort of thing. On the 2nd day, we get into the fabric of space, hypertension, quantum physics, and so on. On the 3rd day, we get into life vegetation, that's the origin of life, thermodynamics and entropy, and molecular chemistry. On the 4th day, we get into the nuclear hypothesis myth. What you're taught in college about the story of the origin is provably not true, but it's still taught in college for some weird reason. The anthropic principle and astrobiology is a science without any evidence. The frustration of astrobiology is there is no life anywhere off the Earth, so trying to study evidence of that is a waste of time because they can't find any. They've been looking for it. But anyway, we move on. We call evolution, you really mean biogenesis, but we get into that on the 5th day, of course, for a lot of reasons. And then we get into the fallacies and frauds of 6th day and all that. And then, of course, the 7th day is a provocative thing because that when God enforces a repose on the universe, he makes the laws firm. So there's another thing I want to highlight, and I'm going to draw for this on the Scientific American articles recently. I'm going to use the symbol of man to represent the reach of man. If I'm going to focus on things larger than man, I'll call that collectively the macrocosm. And the 4th dimension of time, of course, is in that subject. It had a beginning. The big discovery of 20th century science is that the universe is finite, not infinite. It may be expanding, but it's finite, not infinite. That's the problem. That means it had a beginning, and that's why they have these speculations called the Big Bang models. But the fact that it's finite is a key fact. Let's go the other way. Let's go things that are smaller, man. Let's do what we call the microcosm. We discover that in subatomic particles, there's a limit to smallness. That's why we're spending tens of billions of dollars on the Hadron Colliders to try to learn more about smallness. It turns out there's a limit to smallness. It's called the Planck wall, if you will. Indivisible units. Planck limits for length, mass, energy, and time. You would think if I take a piece of string and cut it in half, I can throw the half away and do it again. You think, I could do that forever. I might get so small I couldn't handle it, but conceptually I could always figure whatever I got I can cut in half. I discovered that's not true. When it gets 10 to the minus 33 centimeter, and I try to cut it in half, it loses a property that the physicists call locality. There's a property called non-locality. That thing is provably everywhere in the universe at one time, and that's been proven in the laboratory, by the way. So that's not just a theory anymore. And we now don't think of 3 or 4 dimensions. We know we live in at least 10. That's the current estimate. But the key point that you want to understand the implications of is that both the macrocosm has a finite and of largeness, and there's a finite limit to smallness. That has staggering implications in our understanding of reality. Because the Scientific American article that deals with, see, we live in a finite, digital, simulated universe. It's a virtual digital environment that we find ourselves in. Now, this is not my conclusion. This is the words of Scientific American, June of 2005, where they conclude that our universe is but a shadow of a larger reality. That's their words, not mine. And when I first read that, it blew me away, because that's exactly what the Bible has been saying all along. In John 1, Hebrews 1, on and on. That larger reality, our reality is in a larger context. For lack of another term, I'll call it the metacosm. That's the domain of the angels. That's the domain, apparently, of the UFOs. There's a region that is a transfer function in and out of our finite simulation that we call our physical reality. This is all provable. This isn't theoretical. This is provable stuff. We think of 3 dimensions. We've been taught Euclidean geometry, 3 dimensions. But the most important lecture in mathematics ever given was June 10th of 1854, when George Riemann disclosed metric tensors. It took 60 years for them to find practical use, and that's what Einstein used for his theory of relativity when he recognized that we live in not 3 but 4 dimensions. And so, then in Ephesians chapter 3, Paul tells us that, by the way, if you're watching for it. Ephesians 3:17, that Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that ye, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all saints what is that breadth, length, and depth, and height. To know the love of Christ, which passes knowledge, that you might be filled with all the fullness of God. The point is breadth, length, depth, and height. Anyway, 4 dimensions. Back in the 12th century, a Hebrew sage by the name of Nachmanides, by studying Genesis, concluded the universe has 10 dimensions. We can only know about 4 of them. His writings in his commentary on Genesis. The particle physics in the 20th century have now concluded that we live in about 10 dimensions. That's a current estimate. 4 are directly measurable, 3 in time. 6 of them are curled in less than 10 to the minus 30 centimeters, too small light, so we can only infer them indirectly. In other words, we've spent millions of dollars on atomic accelerators to learn what Nachmanides learned from studying the text of Genesis. And you think I'm kidding, I'm not, I'm quite serious. So most of what we know about the creation is post-curse, because we all know about Genesis 3. History as we know it started after that curse. We had the flood of Noah, among other things, that have increased the entropy, decreased the order, if you will. Now, entropy is called the bondage of decay in Romans 8:21, and there are many of us that believe it was introduced as part of the curse. The universe was fractured, separated from 4 to 6 dimensions is one speculation. And at that curse, we have the physical universe, which we can directly access, but the other 6 dimensions are not accessible to us now. And we call that the spiritual universe, or I would call it the metacosm, if you will. Genesis 3, the shining one, the forbidden fruit, you all know the story, the doubt and then the denial that Satan created that resulted in God's declaration of war, in which the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent are the 2 contestants, if you will, in a sense. And the seed of the woman being a title of Christ, and the seed of the serpent is one who is yet to make his appearance in our history shortly. You are both the pawns and the prize in that warfare. And that's why we're here together on this thing. Why right now? I'm going to put something on the screen which, if you accept, you flunk the course. I want you to challenge. I'm putting it up on sincerely, but I want you to challenge it. I believe that you and I are being plunged into a period of time about which the Bible says more than it does about any other period of time in history, including the time that Jesus walked the shores of Galilee. And so, now, the more you know about the classic biblical scenario and the pending turmoil amidst the current geopolitical tensions every day that are increasing, the more you will recognize that we are indeed plunging into what's called, in the Scripture, the end times. You can prove it. And the encroaching darkness is making all of us increasingly politically incorrect. To be a biblical Christian is going to be increasingly a life-threatening posture you're going to have. And as J. Vernon McGee and others predicted, the attack against the biblical Christian will come from the denominational churches. And that's a shock, but you can find it documented by E.H. Broadbent in his book, The Pilgrim Church. Are you prepared for that? We meet here and enjoy this. This is great. Are you prepared for what's really coming? Are you prepared? Microsoft is not. Okay, I'll try to get another one. Okay. Even correct science won't help you. Only a personal relationship with the designer himself will help you. Do you know him? That's the question of the day. Search the Scriptures, you're challenged by him, and he takes the commitment that you will know. He will assume the responsibility to reveal himself to you. So I'll close with a contemporary example here. Just one, and I'll be off here. In 1980, a man from Rwanda was forced by his tribe to either renounce Christ or face certain death. He refused to renounce Christ, and he was killed on the spot. The night before, he had written the following commitment, which is found in his room. I'm a part of the fellowship of the unashamed. I have Holy Spirit power. The die's been cast. I've stepped over the line. The decision has been made. I'm a disciple of his. I won't look back, let up, slow down, back away, or be still. My past is redeemed. My present makes sense. My future is secure. I'm finished with low living, sight walking, small planning, smooth knees, colorless dreams, tamed visions, mundane talking, cheap living, and dwarf goals. I no longer need preeminence, prosperity, position, promotions, plaudits, or popularity. You can tell you went to seminary because you make an alliteration that proves it's true, right? Okay. I don't have to be right, first, tops, recognized, praised, regarded, or rewarded. I now live by faith. I lean on his presence. I walk by patience. I lift by prayer and labor by power. My face is set. My gait is fast. My goal is heaven. My road is narrow. My way rough. My companions few. My guide reliable. But my mission is clear. I cannot be bought, compromised, detoured, lured away, turned back, deluded, or delayed. I will not flinch in the face of sacrifice, hesitate in the presence of the adversary. I will not negotiate at the table of the enemy. I will not ponder at the pool of popularity or meander in the maze of mediocrity. I won't give up, shut up, let up until I have stayed up, stored up, prayed up, paid up, and preached up for the cause of Christ. Praise God. I'm a disciple of Jesus. I must go till he comes, give till I drop, preach till all know, work till he stops me, and when he comes for his own, he'll have no problems recognizing me. My banner will be clear. Praise God. A little more, but I think I'm over my time. God bless you. Thank you.